Thank you for sharing your joys and sorrows with us, and for those held silently in your hearts. We will now pause for meditation. I will offer a quote to focus us on our meditation and then ring the bell. At that point, I invite you to begin the meditation with 3 deep breaths. After a few minutes, I will ring the bell again to mark the end of our time of meditation. Now, today's prompt is by Thich Nhat Hanh, and it reads as follows. Waking up this morning, I smile. 24 brand new hours before me. I vow to live fully in each moment and to look at all beings with the eyes of compassion. Now is the time in our service where we take an offering. We know it is the gifts of all of us that help support our ability to thrive and gather. Oh, excuse me, before we go to that, we have today's Mother's Day proclamation from Juliet.
Mother's Day Proclamation, Boston, 1870, Julia Ward Howe. Arise then, women of this day. Arise, all women who have hearts, whether our baptism be that of water or of tears. Say firmly, we will not have the great questions decided by irrelevant agencies. Our husbands shall not come to us reeking with carnage for caresses and applause. Our sons shall not be taken from us to unlearn all that we have been able to teach them of charity, mercy, and patience. We, women of one country, will be too tender of those of another country to allow our sons to be trained to injure theirs. From the bosom of the devastated earth, a voice goes up with our own. It says, disarm, disarm. The sword of murder is not the balance of justice. Blood does not wipe out dishonor, nor violence vindicate possession. As men have often forsaken the plow and the anvil at the summons of war, let women now leave all that may be left of home for a great and earnest day of council. Let them first meet as women to bewail and commemorate the dead. Let them then solemnly take counsel with each other as the means whereby the great human family can live in peace. Each bearing after his own kind the sacred impress, not of Caesar, but of God. In the name of womanhood and of humanity, I earnestly ask that a General Congress of Women without limit of nationality may be appointed and held at some place deemed most convenient and at the earliest period consistent with its objects, to promote the alliance of the different nationalities, the amicable settlement of international questions, the great and general interests of peace.
Thank you, Juliet. Fantastic proclamation. So now we have the offertory. We know it is the gifts of all of us that help support our ability to thrive and gather. For those attending in person, we will pass the collection plate. Please use the envelope you'll find in the pew, write your name, and indicate if your offering is part of your pledge or is a donation. For those online, links and instructions will be posted in the chat. You can mail us a check or donate through the PayPal giving page on our website. Please give as generously as you can, since our offerings will be gratefully received.
You find the words in your bulletin, the battle hymn of the Republic. Rise before you.
When the grapes of wrath are storm, he hath loosed the faithful army of his terrible sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. And now I'd like to introduce Ruth Benson, who will be speaking about Julia Ward Howe, a woman of many contradictions.
There was a Mr. Howe, or rather Dr. Howe. He was Samuel Gridley Howe, a physician who gained fame for his participation as a surgeon and a combatant in the Greek War of Independence against the Ottoman Empire. For this, he was awarded the honor of Chevalier of the Greek Order of St. George. Known as Chev to his friends, he was considered the manliest of men, in accordance with the Victorian standards of the time, by which men were judged to be manly by suppressing rather than indulging their sexual proclivities, especially true in puritanical New England. Naturally, as a physician, he knew better than most about the dangers of venereal disease. Samuel was an educator, an advocate for the blind and the institutionalized mentally ill, an abolitionist, and a humanitarian. He was the founding director of the New England Institution for the Education of the Blind, and later, the Massachusetts Experimental School for Teaching and Training Children with Developmental Disabilities. They were actually called the feeble-minded at the time, but I made more appropriate description. He was a bachelor until the age of 42, when he married the young Julia Ward, having channeled his libido into good works, revolutionary causes, and social ambition. Despite this, they managed to produce 6 children. Samuel, though a transcendentalist and liberal-minded in many respects, apparently did not get the memo about gender equality, a core transcendentalist principle along with the abolition of slavery, free education, and workers' rights. He felt a married woman's place was in the home, nor did he feel it was seemly for a woman to have a career. Thus, he denied Julia, who was a poet and a vocal supporter of abolitionist and suffragist causes, the right to a public stage. In 1854, pro-slavery forces in Kansas tried to overturn the Missouri Compromise of 1820. They were relying on votes of new white male residents to determine if the vast Missouri-Kansas territory would be slave or free. Samuel became secretary of a Kansas Aid Committee that was formed to send anti-slavery immigrants as well as weapons to Kansas. When this effort failed, a group of transcendentalist Unitarians, known as the Secret Six, including the radical ministers Theodore Parker and Thomas Higginson, pledged to support John Brown in his attempt to foment a slave insurrection. His plan was to capture the U.S. Armory in Virginia at Harper's Ferry and to raise a multiracial guerrilla force in the Appalachians. The plan failed, and Brown was captured and tried for treason. The collaborators fled. Samuel told Julia that he too had helped Brown and warned her that men might be coming, and galloped off, leaving her in the last stage of a difficult pregnancy. In the autumn of 1861, Samuel was appointed to the new U.S. Sanitary Commission, overseeing the condition of military camps, health care, and humanitarian support. He and Julia traveled to Washington along with their minister, James Freeman Clark, and Governor John Albion Andrew, and his wife, Eliza. This ladies' expedition included sightseeing, a brief meeting with President Lincoln, and a review of Army troops protecting the Capitol. They visited the 1st Massachusetts Artillery, headed by Colonel William Batchelor Greene, a West Point graduate and Unitarian minister, who was married to Anna Blake Shaw, sister of Francis George Shaw. While her husband was engaged elsewhere, Colonel Greene invited Julia to deliver a brief speech to rally his soldiers to the cause of anti-slavery. She reluctantly agreed, and the applause of the soldiers and the praise of Governor Andrew, who called her the heroine of the day, resulted in more stirring addresses to the troops and a consequential encounter that formed the foundation upon which her reputation was built. Returning from a review of Union troops outside Alexandria, Julia and Reverend Clark rode together in a carriage, accompanied by regiments from Wisconsin and Pennsylvania singing John Brown's Body. Clark, sensing that the rough language of the lyric, John Brown's body lies moldering in the grave, might be disturbing to her, suggested, "Mrs. Howe, why do you not write some good words for this stirring tune?" She confessed she had often wished to do so, but had not found the inspiration. But now she awoke before dawn in her bed at the Willard Hotel with the first stanza of the Battle Hymn of the Republic rising within her. Of the writing of the lyrics, she remembered, "I went to bed that night as usual and slept, according to my wont, quite soundly. I awoke in the gray of the morning twilight, and as I lay waiting for the dawn, the long lines of the desired poem began to twine themselves in my mind. Having thought out all the stanzas, I said to myself, I must get up and write these verses down, lest I fall asleep again and forget them. So, with a sudden effort, I sprung out of bed and found in the dimness an old stump of a pencil which I remembered to have used the day before. I scrawled the verses almost without looking from the paper. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. She continued to write through the oncoming dawn until she returned to bed thinking, I like this better than most things I've written. The poem was published in the Atlantic Monthly on February 1862. It was gradually adopted as the anthem of the Union cause. Following the overwhelming success of her Battle Hymn of the Republic and back in Boston, Julia began to chafe under the demands of her chauvinist husband. As Samuel continued to build his reputation as a reformer and a hero, Julia wrote 6 lectures on practical ethics. Here we begin to see the contradiction between her outward life and her beliefs. Her third essay, Moral Triangulation, or The Third Party, is a meditation on divorce and secession. In it, she asks, if North and South agree to set aside their bonds of union and to become 2 republics, why should they not do it? And yet, in marriage, she continued to advocate preserving the union. Samuel had decreed that she was not to lecture in public for a fee, so instead Julia read her essays and other writings at home before invited guests. She recited her battle hymn in Boston at the dedication of the statue of John Brown, and recited before large audiences in Washington with President Lincoln himself in attendance. But when she told Samuel that she had planned a lecture circuit in New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, with the proceeds to be donated to the Sanitary Commission, his response was such that she wrote in her journal, "Some illusions left me today, giving way to unwholesome facts." We can only surmise that his response was less than supportive. Nonetheless, she continued to accept invitations to speak or to recite her poems at significant events, such as the 70th birthday celebration for William Cullen Bryant in New York, where she was the only woman on the program. Samuel, who continued to oppose her public speaking, could not have been delighted to read the news reports that she was received with much applause. Most significantly, at this time in their married life, she wrote an essay called Polarity, in which she posited that the roles of men and women were not innate, but were determined by social factors. A true transcendentalist, she believed that if the education and self-development accorded to men were equally available to women, a true complementarity of the sexes could evolve. Although this idea continued to guide her activism for the rest of her life, it did no good at home. When she announced to Samuel that she would be preaching at the Charlestown Women's Prison on the evening of their wedding anniversary in 1865, her eldest daughters objected, taking their father's side in the struggle to keep Julia at home and in her proper place as wife and mother. Samuel, she wrote in her journal, attacked me with the utmost vehemence and temper, calling my undertaking a mere courting of publicity. I have been married 22 years today. In the course of this time, I have never known my husband to approve of any act of mine which I myself valued. Books, poems, essays, everything has been contemptible or contraband in his eyes because it was not his way of doing things. When the abolitionist Governor John Albion Andrews suddenly died of stroke, Julia wrote a poem for the memorial service. Samuel forbade her to read it in public. Then, without consulting her, he rented out both their townhouse and their country home, obliging them to take up residence in stark quarters at the School for the Blind, where he continued his earlier work. This must have been the last straw for Julia, because she then threw herself wholeheartedly into public life. She was a delegate at the 1868 National Conference of Unitarians and other liberal Christian churches in New York, which she followed with a trip to Boston to attend a women's rights meeting. It was at this meeting that, upon hearing the impassioned voice of Lucy Stone expressing support for women's suffrage, something awoke in her that harmonized with my own aspirations, she wrote. And with that, she became the new president of the New England Women's Suffrage Association, thereby rejecting whatever domestic authority Samuel thought he held over her. In a split with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she sided with Lucy Stone in her support of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. The right of U.S. citizens to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In Julia's principal view as an abolitionist, the logical outcome of abolition was the franchise. As women were not considered to be citizens, the rights of the black man had to come first. Women's suffrage would have to wait. And yet, as a transcendentalist, she was an ardent feminist, and as a radical Unitarian, she saw how traditional religion helped to oppress women. I felt how much the masculine administration of religious doctrine has overridden us women, and I felt how partial and one-sided a view of these matters had been inculcated by men and handed down by men revering mothers. She told her daughters, "We need to have a womanly side of religion represented." As she deepened her understanding of the value of a female perspective, she moved further away from compliance with the male-dominated worldview. With the support of her minister, James Freeman Clark, and her experience as a lay teacher in the Church of the Disciples, and with the female solidarity of the women's suffrage movement, she became dedicated to developing the role of women in the church. As president of the First Women's Ministerial Association, she organized women ministers, both ordained and unordained. The trajectory of her life, from compliant housewife to dedicated champion of abolition, women's rights, and voting rights for all citizens, led to a more reflective life that lifted up the feminist. She deepened her religious convictions about the role of women in the liberal church. She saw that her battle hymn, driven by a male-dominated view of the war against slavery, had romanticized bloodshed. During the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, in an impassioned cry in repudiation of the use of war, she called upon women of all nations to rise up and establish an International Mother's Day for peace. In her proclamation, she cries out, "Disarm, disarm, the sword of murder is not the balance of justice. Blood does not wipe out dishonor, nor violence vindicate possession." On this Mother's Day, she sets a strong example to women to assert their beliefs, to be authentic and true to themselves, and to create within themselves a positive role model for their children.
Thank you so much, Ruth. That was really wonderful. I now want to get a biography of Julia Ward Howe. Let's see. Now join us for singing our closing hymn, which is number 162, Gonna Lay Down My Sword and Shield. I believe that's in your gray hymnal.
Gray hymnal number 162, please rise and sing.
My sword and shield, by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. I'm going to lay down my sword and shield, down by the riverside, and I the Lord no more. I ain't gonna study war no more, gonna study war no more. Down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. Thank you. Now is the moment that we will extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. For these we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Our closing words are by Leah Ongiri. How to pronounce this? Ongiri, Weavers of One Story. Here we are together, each facing our different human tasks, or maybe the same central one, to embrace the lessons life delivers, to discern and respond as we grow, to refuse harm and cherish flourishing. May we know ourselves as vessels of infinite possibility, holders of each other's heartaches and tales of joy alike, weavers of one story in which we each have our part. Thank you. And so ends our service. Please join us in the parish hall for hospitality. And for those who are online, please join in your virtual coffee hour following this service. Thank you.